Hi guys! In this video, we'll be going over cases 5 and 13 of the regional case set. Both of these cases are about ongoing attempts to combat racial inequality, which is why we decided to group them together. Let's get started with case 5, which is titled What's in a Name? This case is about the naming process, especially for buildings on college and university campuses. The case starts by giving an example about the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, in which the Commission on History, Race, and a Way Forward at UNC recommended changing the names of 5 buildings. These buildings were named after people who occupied high positions of influence and public trust, but these people were also known to be involved in the support of white supremacist violence, Jim Crow segregation, and the disenfranchisement of black voters. This leads to the question, were these individuals simply products of their racist times? Or is this not enough of an excuse? After all, the case points out that these people yielded the power, wealth, and influence needed to make change. Additionally, the presence of these names on college campuses can be demoralizing, dehumanizing, and psychologically burdensome for members of marginalized groups. The case then follows up with 2 ideas. How do we determine which names to remove? Is there a set of standards or methods that we should use? And since moral standards are constantly changing, even between decades, is it possible for us to make lasting decisions about building names? With that, let's get on to the case questions. The first question asks us, as task forces across the country continue to deliberate about the best way forward, what principles should guide their decisions to remove names? We can start answering this question by exploring it through a consequential and deontological point of view. Remember, consequentialism is focused on the consequences and real-world effects of an action, but deontology is more focused on the intent of an action. When people choose names for a building, these names are usually not chosen with the intent to hurt other people. Most of the time, they're selected to honor a positive part of that person's legacy. So, a deontologist would believe that we don't need to remove names, because the intention is to positively endorse only the good things about that person's character. But of course, as we know, people are not completely good. There are many examples of figures in history who made a positive impact on America, but have also engaged in things that are morally and arguably objectively wrong, like slavery. Someone's positive impact does not justify their wrongdoings, especially since the case argues that many namesakes for campus buildings had the opportunity and ability to make a change, but chose not to. So clearly, even though names are not chosen with the intention to hurt others, a consequentialist would still recognize that these names can have adverse impacts. With this reasoning, it would be better to use consequentialist thinking when deciding to remove names or not. By doing this, we would be considering the impacts that these names have on society. Now, here's where it gets really tricky. Where do we draw that line? How do we figure out whether or not a building should be named after someone? Should we say that a building can only be named after someone if and only if that person has a completely untarnished reputation? But is that even possible? If not, then how do we grapple with varying levels of moral impunity? Is owning slaves as morally bad as upholding Jim Crow segregation, or are they different? Since there are a ton of different ways to respond to these questions, please keep them in mind, and we'll discuss these during our next meeting.
The second question says, what is the moral significance of a building naming and renaming? Does it matter whether the building are publicly or privately owned? Does it matter what sort of institution to which the name is attached? So, with questions that are a little complicated, we're going to try to focus on one part at a time. The first part is, what is the moral significance of a building naming and renaming? I think regardless of different times or not, we can agree that naming a building or a place after a person is recognizing that person as an important figure in history, all morals aside. Now, the moral significance that comes is the thing up for debate. By placing importance on this person or figure, are we also placing honor and praise on this figure? Can we ignore the wrongdoings of a person in certain aspects but honor them in another perspective? Now, moving on to the second part of the question. It says, does it matter whether the buildings are publicly or privately owned? Privately owned buildings are probably funded in a more personal manner. Therefore, it is pretty safe to argue that the person has the right to put whatever they want on their property. But whether or not this private-owned building will be affecting others should also be what we consider. And here's a question to think about. Out of morality, should we or should we not put something disrespectful to a population away, even if it's on your own privately owned property? Now the last part of the question. Does it matter what sort of institution to which the name is attached? In the case, it states that some feel by placing these figures' names in school campuses, marginalized student groups will be disrespected. Therefore, comparing campus to campus, these names will be affecting larger and smaller populations depending on the marginalized student group there. However, I personally think that in such instances, if something is disrespectful in one place, it should be disrespectful everywhere. The third question says, are building names analogous to public monuments and memorials? And how about other named features of the academic world, such as labs, fellowships, prizes, endowed chairs, and so on? As with the last question, we're dividing this question into two parts. First, we need to consider the question, are building names analogous to public monuments and memorials? Buildings are similar to public memorials and monuments in a way that many passerbys can still view the building and most of the time can see the name if they look closely. However, there are also differences because public monuments and memorials are more obviously honoring a person, while names on a building recognize one aspect of a figure's achievements or contribution, such as in the field of study, because buildings in school campuses are usually associated with one subject. For example, humanities building named after a person. Consider these differences and similarities while we move on to the second part. This part questions, how about other named features of the academic world, such as labs, fellowships, or prizes? Summarizing that, it means other than recognizing a name through placing it on a building, how does placing their name on awards or prizes affect the morality of it, given that the name is associated with some wrongdoings in the past using today's standards? I think a distinction is that having a name on an award makes you immediately associate that person's important contribution with that award specifically, perhaps math, science, or peace, etc. But placing a person's name on a building may sometimes cross the line, making some think it's honoring the person in general, using today's moral standards, that they were doing wrong things in the past. Alright, we're wrapping up this case here and moving on to the next case.
Let's move on to case 13, titled Defunding the Police. This case is based on activist demands to defund the police following the trends of police violence against African Americans. Of course, it's important to understand that this three-word slogan obviously is not a detailed policy agenda, and many people have different ideas and approaches when it comes to this issue. The case talks about two main approaches to defunding the police. The first is to literally abolish the police, at least the police force as we know it. The reason for this is that American policing has historically been associated with enforcing slavery and suppressing labor activism. This history, combined with studies that show how modern policing disproportionately affects African Americans, motivates some to think that we should completely abolish the police force and either not have a police force at all or fundamentally rebuild the system. The second way to approaching defunding the police is to divert funds that would normally go to the police force to other services, like education, employment, and mental health services. There are two main reasons for this. First, the vast majority of emergency calls involve nonviolent offenses that don't require police. And second, studies have also shown that funding the police doesn't correlate to decreases in crime. These studies also show that achieving equity in education and employment are actually much more effective for reducing crime. The rest of the case explains that, as of now, a majority of Americans oppose defunding the police, despite the fact that many local governments are already changing their systems of policing.
Before we continue on to the questions, I'd highly suggest you pause here and read the case if you haven't already done so. Question 1 asks if, in effect, American policing as an institution is incapable of being reformed meaningfully due to its racially oppressive history. Due to the contentious nature of this topic, we'll be discussing two stances on the issue, although there are certainly many different perspectives you could adopt, and I would readily suggest you explore them. One stance against would offer that, from a utilitarian perspective, while it's a larger obligation of any government institution to attempt to create the best outcomes for its citizens as possible, that policing as an institution has become so embedded in the very notion of law enforcement in liberal democracy that it would be politically unfeasible to suggest anything but reform, and that in the focus of what system we would need to replace policing, that we would utilize valuable political capital we could have otherwise utilized in order to make broader changes. Furthermore, this stance notes that while policing as a phenomenon within the United States necessitates interacting with unique issues, such as increased presence of guns, that there are still meaningful discrepancies in how policing is conducted, not only between municipalities but between different countries, such that we could still potentially make many important changes depending on what policy reforms have been effective globally. And understanding that the racially oppressive history of an institution doesn't necessarily indicate that later variations must have the same flaws, this perspective would argue, therefore, that if policing is simply a representation of a status quo, then it would apply that racial reform must occur in government and culture first and foremost. The stance in favor of a view that it is incapable of reform, however, would indicate that even following significant civil rights reforms within government, there are still major examples of implicit bias in police shootings, police brutality, mass incarceration, and systemic barriers to reform that disproportionately negatively impact minority groups. Even in light of its many reforms, policing still has incredible difficulty ridding itself of the long-term effects of its racially oppressive history, to the extent in which it still continues to harm many of the very communities it is supposed to serve. Utilizing the same utilitarian viewpoint, this perspective would argue that in order to truly produce the best outcomes for most people, we must emphasize a shift past this institution towards others that may do an even better job of upholding the law in marginalized communities. And while this shift seems unlikely, noting the relevance of policing to the status quo, its relatively short history as an institution, and the fact that the vast majority of calls it response to are nonviolent, even in the case of significant police militarization, could be used to argue that it has been long deserving of an upheaval. Of course, I'd like to note that there's always nuance you could add to this. It doesn't simply have to be that policing is incapable of reform or that it is capable of such. You could also argue that certain aspects of policing, such as its response to nonviolent, victimless offenses, could be done in a different manner, while retaining the segments of it that are capable of speedy response to emergency situations. I would truly encourage you to think over this. The second case question asks if activists are obligated to make their demands more palatable to the public in order to achieve their goals. While this isn't as contentious as the earlier question, there are still many stances you could adopt. First and foremost, the perspective in favor could argue activists are indeed obligated to make their demands more palatable, because the larger intention of activism is not only to message and inform, but to create actual political change with the intent of reforming a particular issue, presumably in a manner that would benefit more people than the status quo before it. In this sense, activism would not only be bound to the issue it seeks to change, but the political realities of the climate in which it operates. Someone who wishes to stop anthropogenic climate change in government, for example, cannot feasibly propose changes that would fall outside of budgetary limitations or policies that could not be passed in Congress. In the same sense, activists could not readily propose policies or changes that would fall outside of these considerations, because that would make it increasingly difficult to move towards unnecessary political changes that could benefit others. This would also relate to the importance of raising popular support by appealing to the public, as without such political clout, it's entirely unlikely any legislative considerations would be made in the first place. In the potential best-case scenario, it would follow that a limited compromise of the proposed policies would be passed through that may be less effective than imagined. In the worst-case scenario, the proposals would be legislatively gridlocked even in the event of popular support. On the other hand, the stance against such would imply that the primary intention of activism is simply to increase messaging and awareness of the issue at hand, and that even if the given demands are legislatively unreasonable, it is the obligation of politicians to meet them as best as possible, provided it gains popular support. In that sense, it could be argued that it's not important for the activists to make their demands palatable to the public as long as they raise awareness about the issue itself, as the public will moderate what demands it feels are reasonable and negate support for unreasonable demands. Of course, one particular issue with this perspective is that it also negates the implications of making unpalatable demands to the public, which could potentially fuel a narrative and not only distracts from the issue the activists are talking about, but also makes it harder for the public to accept the issue seriously. This was one reaction in particular that we saw with respect to defund the police slogan by conservative media, as well as an emphasis on instances of rioting and looting that only compromised a minority of the social activism we saw, yet remained a cornerstone of a media narrative against such reform.
So that wraps up our video for cases 5 and 13. See you guys next meeting!